there is supposedly a device that exists that allows the user to look back into any point in time in existence. The conspiracy is that the Vatican saw the power that this device held and decided to keep it a secret, covering up and hiding any proof that exists. But before we dive deeper into that, let me ask you this. What would you do if you could replay any point in the past with absolute accuracy? Would you start small? Would you go back to that argument with your significant other last week and show them proof that they did promise to do the dishes or take out the trash? Or would you start big? Would you go back to the grassy knoll in November of 1963 and solve the Kennedy assassination? Maybe you would peer into the skies above Roswell, New Mexico in July of 1947. Would you have the bravery to look upon one of history's most influential moments, a moment that has defined the course of Western civilization? A moment which, if proven to be a lie, might threaten to upend the lives of billions of people. If you had the power to replay the crucifixion of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, would you? This is the question that one Benedictine monk faced in the 1950s. If his story is to be believed, this is the tale of Father Pellegrino Ernetti and his most famous invention, a device that allowed its user to peer back through the mists of time to whatever point in history they desired. The chronovisor, not a time travel device, but a time viewer. Although supposedly revealed as a hoax, evidence suggests that the chronovisor story should, at the very least, be reevaluated. But before we begin, a special thanks to astrophysicist Massimo Terodorani. Most accounts of the chronovisor are in languages other than English. The few English language sources that exist are either light on details or prohibitively expensive since they are out of print. With the author's permission, we were able to secure a copy of Dr. Teodorani's Il Cronovisore, Sogno del Futuro o Esperimento Reali. One of the most recent books on the subject of Dr. Teodorani has permitted us, and only us, to translate portions of his book, providing you with what should be one of the most in-depth versions of the story ever presented in English on YouTube. Thank you, Massimo. Now, if not for a happy coincidence, we might have never known about the chronovisor. It might forever have remained a rumor only whispered in secret circles among the Vatican elite. Thankfully, history dropped the chronovisor story into the lap of French Catholic priest Francois Brune, someone who not only had connections within the church, but whose esoteric interest allowed him to realize the magnitude of the story and treat it quite seriously. Francois had an interesting background. He was born in France in 1931. He was exceptionally well trained, educated at the Sorbonne in Paris, earning a theology degree from the Institut Catholique and teaching at some of Europe's most important seminaries. Francois was regarded as an expert in ancient languages like Latin, Greek, Assyro-Babylonian, Hebrew, and ancient Egyptian. Now, alongside this conventional trajectory, Francois nursed a fascination with the border between life and death. Much of his work was preoccupied with using modern scientific theories such as quantum physics to shed light onto his faith. This naturally brought him to the fledgling field of parapsychology. Francois even became involved in the French chapter of IANS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. This was the sort of man with whom fate decided to share the chronovisor story. I studied 2 years at the Biblical Institute in Rome, Francois later explained, and one time, on my way there, I decided to hitchhike to Venice. The year was 1964, and Francois found himself on a boat ride crossing Venice's Grand Canal to the island of San Giorgio. Over the course of this journey, he met and started a conversation with a fellow Catholic, a monk by the name of Pellegrino Ernetti. Francois and Pellegrino hit it right off. Speaking of their shared studies, both held a deep love of ancient languages. Before long, however, Pellegrino shifted the conversation. When asked to describe this exchange, Francois recalled, "First, we spoke about the interpretation of the New Testament and about how in our era many were attempting to strip biblical history of its marvelous components. The world is critical of miracles, healings, exorcisms, anything that seems supernatural. And from there, we soon went on the subject of communication with the beyond." Thus, little by little, Ernetti ended up bringing up something that was of greater interest to me. Pellegrino Ernetti told Francois that aspects of the Bible were not necessarily open to interpretation. After all, he had seen them himself with his own two eyes. Now, naturally, Francois was intrigued. Over the next several decades, he would tease the details of this stupendous claim out of his new friend. Eventually, Francois, not a gullible or naive scholar by any stretch of the imagination, would come to wholeheartedly believe that Pellegrino was telling the truth about his ability to look into the past. In 2002, Francois at last released a book, Les Nouveaux Mystères du Vatican, or The Vatican's New Mystery, comprehensively detailing the entire saga. Much of what we know about the chronovisor comes from Francois' book. It turns out that Father Pellegrino Ernetti practically stumbled upon the idea for the chronovisor by accident. Born in 1925, Pellegrino's career rivaled that of Francois' in its eclecticism. In addition to his deep commitments to his faith, he became an ardent student of quantum physics, a renowned exorcist, and, above all, an internationally famous musicologist. From his convent on the Venetian island of San Giorgio Maggiore, he became one of the world's foremost authorities on pre-polyphony ancient musical traditions with only one unaccompanied melody, like plainsong. As a matter of fact, Gregorian chant indirectly inspired the chronovisor. Over the course of his studies, Pellegrino would regularly drop in on a colleague in Milan, Father Agostino Gemelli, an expert in the use of oscilloscopes. Pellegrino wanted to see if he could take existing recordings of Gregorian chants and, using oscillography, isolate and remove their harmonics. The hope was that a more authentic, pure sound could be obtained. However, on one occasion in 1952, the tape recorder that they were using began to malfunction. Frustrated for his colleague, Agostino called out to his deceased father, as he often did in times of need. "Dad, help me," he whispered. Pellegrino and Agostino were not trying to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. They were simply carrying out a musicology experiment. Yet, when they played the tapes back, both of them were astounded by what they heard. A voice, that of Agostino's father, responding, "Of course I'll help you. I'm always with you." Agostino had no desire to listen any further, but Pellegrino's mind was racing. Had they contacted the dead, or had they somehow reached across time? The idea for the chronovisor was born. Eventually, Pellegrino Ernetti managed to convince Agostino that they had stumbled upon something marvelous. He was putting together a team, a group of scientists who would seek to harness the power of electronics to break through the fabric of reality itself. It is not entirely clear exactly who was involved in this project or when it convened. The group may have formed as early as 1953, although there is some indication that it was several years later, around 1956. Either way, it is broadly agreed that Pellegrino and Agostino assembled a team of a dozen scientists to develop the chronovisor. Several specialists have been regularly identified. Among them was an undisclosed Japanese Nobel Prize winner, a Portuguese professor by the name of De Matos, famed physicist Enrico Fermi, and one of his students and NASA space scientist and ex-German aerospace engineer, Werner von Braun. Although von Braun's presence is unsettling, it is unsurprising. Following their defeat in World War II, many former Germans were absorbed into the scientific establishment in Allied power countries. For better or worse, the United States of America likely would not have won the space race of the 1960s if not for the involvement of German war criminals like von Braun. Returning to the chronovisor, Pellegrino Ernetti never divulged the exact location of the laboratory, or laboratories where its development took place. It is likely several locations. Nor is it entirely apparent how the chronovisor was constructed. Alleged blueprints can be found online, but they remain vague at best, and suffice to say, no one has been able to replicate the success that Pellegrino and Agostino's team supposedly achieved. Loosely, it seems that the chronovisor picked up on sound and light waves across various spectra. This was achieved through the careful positioning of several antennae, 3 of which were constructed out of supposedly mysterious metals. Each of these were connected in a chain. Using what has been referred to as a direction finder dial on the device, the chronovisor was tuned into a specific time and place, which would then be displayed on a viewing screen. Now, in some accounts, the presentation was more like a 3-dimensional black and white hologram. Either way, the screen included recording capabilities to capture an objective view of any event in human history. It was this capability, the recording apparatus, that eventually led to accusations of fraud. But that part of the story didn't unfold until decades later, way later, before the entire chronovisor affair came tumbling down like a house of cards. Pellegrino and his team claimed to see a number of events throughout history exactly as they had occurred. Now, according to his story, Pellegrino Ernetti and the scientists did not immediately begin indulging their deepest curiosities about events in the distant past, but instead, as Pellegrino put it, their first order of business was to verify what we were seeing was authentic. In other words, to queue up recent events whose content could be verified against existing historical documents. Therefore, the team started more recently. They spun the dial back just a few years, tuning to a speech by a former Italian dictator, Benito Mussolini. Sure enough, there was the monster himself, clear as day. They then began moving the dial further and further back in time. The next stop was the late 18th century, during the life of Napoleon Bonaparte. Pellegrino and the scientist watched several episodes from the military commander's life, including his speech about abolishing the Republic of Venice. Further and further back they went. Next, they were granted a glimpse of the Roman markets during the reign of Emperor Trajan, sometime around the 2nd century. Now, this was followed by an appearance of Cicero's speech to the Roman Senate in 63 BC. Then a look at Thyestes, a lost play by one of Rome's most important writers, Quintus Ennius, from just before his death. The chronovisor's fidelity was remarkable. They could make out every word. In fact, Pellegrino claimed that they could transcribe the entire text as it was recited in Rome in 169 BC during the public games in honor of Apollo. Pellegrino and the scientist were both amazed and ecstatic. With this technology, every mystery from the past could now finally be revealed. No longer would we have to debate the finer points of history. Lost art could be recovered. The smallest moments of historical figures' lives could be recorded. The chronovisor might even be able to revolutionize the legal system, ensuring an accurate perception of crimes and other disputes. We could even look back in time to see who first had the idea for Sbarro Pizza and hold them accountable. But dare they? Dare they look back into the events from the Bible to judge for themselves the accuracy of the foundations of their faith? The possibility was too tantalizing to ignore. With shaking hands, Pellegrino and the scientists tuned the dial to 36 AD. Pellegrino later shared with Francois Brune what they beheld, saying this: I saw everything: the agony in the garden, the betrayal of Judas, the trial, the Calvary. We tried to capture the passion. We immediately ran into a difficulty. However monstrous this torture, the crucifixion, may be, at the time it was frequent. There were many crucifixes. Which one was Jesus's? So we tried to trace a little higher and we arrived at the Last Supper. From that moment, we saw it and we never left it. It was the year 36 of our era, and these scenes were captured between the 12th and the 14th of January 1956. To top things off, Pellegrino and the team took a quick look at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which unfolded just as it had in the Bible. Supposedly, Pellegrino would look back upon other events throughout the history of the world only to learn that others before him had invented chronovisor-like devices as well. In fact, Pellegrino Ernetti allegedly said, "I know Nostradamus. He was both an alchemist and a physicist. He too experimented with the chronovisor. It was he who taught me that the chronovision technique is possible." The fact that others had discovered the secret behind peering back in time begs the question: how exactly was the chronovisor supposed to work? The most obvious problem with Pellegrino Ernetti's narrative is how a third-person perspective of past events was obtained. Put another way, who or what was the cameraman at these points in history? At a 1986 press conference in Riva del Garda, after many had already dismissed the chronovisor as a hoax, Pellegrino vaguely explained that all of our physiognomy is visual energy that is released from us, from our epidermis, and all the words we say are sound energy. Now, once emitted, every energy is no longer destroyed. If anything, it is transformed, therefore it remains eternal in the airspace. We need tools that capture these energies and reconstruct them in such a way as to give us back the person or historical event we are looking for. Therefore, we will have the whole present in time and space. Well then, when you put it that way, it makes perfect sense. Now, if we read between the lines of what Pellegrino was saying, it seems as though the chronovisor somehow intercepted echoes drifting through space since the beginning of time. Apparently, everything that happens generates these echoes as we progress. The idea has some basis in reality. We know that all of the electromagnetic waves that human beings have broadcast are still propagating their way out further and further out through the universe. Could a similar form of information generated by existence itself continue to reverberate through our own reality, waiting to be picked up by sufficiently advanced technology? Dr. Massimo explains this. But what should we do to receive and record our past events? Take us somewhere 73 light years away to be able to pick up on the signs of our past. It is obviously absurd. At the same time, Ernetti said that the images and sounds of the past would remain recorded in a sort of sphere that envelops the Earth and would function as a kind of magnetic tape. What sphere is it? And how does it retain information from the past? Is there a part of the electromagnetic radiation that we emit that, instead of traveling far into space, remains anchored to our planet? As he continues to explain, spiritual disciplines have described similar mechanisms. He mentions ancient notions of the Akashic field, a metaphysical idea where everything that was, is, or will be is somehow recorded in a vast store of knowledge outside of time and space. Now, typically, this realm is only accessible to mystics or our higher selves, or, as it seems, those in possession of devices like the chronovisor. Was Pellegrino Ernetti somehow able to tap into the Akashic field, allowing him to perceive this wealth of knowledge? Massimo is a trained astrophysicist. As such, he exercises a healthy degree of skepticism, but manages to retain his sense of wonder. He speculates, while emphasizing that it is merely a speculation, that the answer may lie somewhere in the realm of quantum physics. Unlike most people who speculate on quantum physics, Massimo is actually trained in the discipline, giving his thoughts a little more weight than other writers. However, I'm not trained in quantum physics, so most of this goes over my head and we'll just have to take his word for it. A little bit more accessible is the additional evidence that Massimo provides in the form of one of Pellegrino Ernetti's contemporaries, Don Luigi Borello. Now, Luigi shared many of the same interests as Pellegrino. Like him, Luigi was a scientist and a priest, although he received much more scientific training than his counterpart. As luck would have it, it was actually Don Luigi Borello who first coined the term chronovision. Sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? Unlike Pellegrino Ernetti, Luigi had been slowly, meticulously working alone towards proving that looking into the past was possible. From his laboratory in Liguria, Italy, Luigi obtained what he believed were experimental proofs that chronovision was at least theoretically sound. Luigi's interpretation of chronovision differed significantly from Pellegrino's. He discounted the possibility that any astral sphere around the Earth was recording events. Instead, he grew to believe that objects, stones in particular, had the ability to memorize events, replaying them either spontaneously or on command. Unlike Pellegrino Ernetti, whose chronovisor results were always mired in controversy, Luigi had the data to prove that his idea had some merit, carrying out rigorous studies under controlled laboratory conditions. Dr. Teodorani provides one example of the types of tests Luigi conducted. In one memorable experiment, he placed the loudspeaker of a stereo device in front of a pumice stone, flooding the stone with waves reproducing the frequencies of a song. After some time, the stone was stimulated, and later, using an oscilloscope, certainly the most important part of the chronovisor, as an interpretive sensor, it was possible to return what was memorized from the song. It was enough to compare the oscillographic traces emitted by the song with those emitted after successively first stimulating and then auscultating the stone. The idea of stones recording old events only to replay them later might sound familiar to any of you ghost hunting aficionados out there. While most people believe that hauntings are caused by the spirits of the dead, another popular theory holds that the surrounding environment, stones especially, somehow record emotional or traumatic events. This energy is then released under certain parameters, letting events from the past play out once again in life-like fashion. This idea, known as the stone tape theory, has been discussed in one form or another among parapsychologists for nearly 2 centuries now. In fact, some believe that the stone tape theory is especially useful when describing hauntings where ghosts fail to acknowledge eyewitnesses. In these scenarios, ghosts instead mechanically repeat their previous actions in a never-ending loop, much like a recording, rather than an intelligent spirit. It seems possible, however unlikely, that every event is embedded on features in the landscape, waiting for the right opportunity to replay themselves. Perhaps the chronovisor harnessed this information, allowing us to witness historical incidents long since past. Now, Don Luigi Borello documented his findings according to scientific principles. Pellegrino Ernetti did not, unfortunately. In fact, the two found themselves in numerous controversies over the years, even lobbing threats of lawsuits back and forth. When trying to verify the existence of the chronovisor, we mostly only have the personal testimony of Pellegrino to work from. Today, the chronovisor is nowhere to be found. Shocking, right? Perhaps it was destroyed. Perhaps it is kept hidden in the deepest, most secret vaults in the Vatican. We'll never know. Only once was the chronovisor ever used outside of the inner circle of scientists who developed it, at a private audience with Pope Pius XII, Italian President Giovanni Grunchi, and select members of the Pontifical Academy. Right away, however, those involved in the project expressed concerns about the immense power that the chronovisor signified. In fact, the Pope forbade Pellegrino to share any news about it. You see, with the chronovisor, private lives could be made public. The authority of both religious and secular organizations could be completely undermined. Pellegrino was deeply concerned about what might happen if this technology got into the wrong hands, or even the public, saying this: because it takes away the freedom of speech, action, and thought, therefore it is capturable. In other words, it will be possible by any means of the machine to know what the neighbor or the adversary thinks. There would be two consequences: either a massacre of humanity, or, which is difficult, a new morality would be born. This is why it is necessary that these devices do not fall within everyone's reach, but remain under the direct control of the authorities. Yeah, that's a good idea, right? Despite the Pope's ban on speaking about the chronovisor, Pellegrino began talking, if only quietly. There is evidence to suggest that his statements drew the ire of some highly placed church officials. And by the 1970s, Pellegrino Ernetti was letting news of the chronovisor slip into a series of what Dr. Teodorani calls more or less incautious public statements, sharing vague descriptions of the device and what his team had witnessed. He provided excerpts in Latin from the play Thyestes and, in 1972, released photographs from the chronovisor itself. On May 2nd, La Domenica del Corriere published Pellegrino Ernetti's chronovisor claims in a piece entitled "A Machine That Photographs the Past Has Finally Been Invented." Included in the story was a picture of the face of Jesus Christ at his crucifixion, captured using the chronovisor. Immediately, the photograph was met with skepticism. The most damning evidence came from someone who said that the picture was clearly a statue. Not only that, but they knew exactly which statue: the face on a wooden crucifix carved by Spanish artist Culot Valera. The statue was even on display for everyone to see at the Sanctuary of Merciful and Eucharistic Love in Coravalenza, Italy, near Todi. As final proof, the reader actually provided a holy card from the shrine, which shows clear similarities, suggesting that Pellegrino Ernetti had simply lightened and inverted the image. Now, in his defense, he asserted that the design of the crucifix had been based upon the guidance of a Mother Speranza. Now, Speranza claimed to have experienced mystical visions of the Passion firsthand. The photograph and the statue simply looked identical because the Christ on the crucifix was highly accurate to what he actually looked like. Pellegrino told Francois Brune, "There's a resemblance between the image we have seen and the sculpture by Culot Valera is amazing. Our Christ was captured in 1953, while the Coravalenza one was built about 6 years later. And when Mother Speranza saw it in our photos, she jumped for joy because it corresponded to the one in her vision. These are historical facts. Or are they? It is a convenient explanation." Since then, Pellegrino Ernetti's defenders have suggested that he included the photo of Christ as an example of the sorts of things that the chronovisor had captured, not as literal proof. If so, this was a foolish course of action and only further undermined his claims. Francois Brune, who had known Pellegrino Ernetti for 8 years by this point, would claim that he knew that the photo was a fraud as soon as it was released. But this by no means meant that his friend was lying. "It was a fake photo, of course," he later said. "It's simple. Some people who worked on the chronovisor said that the machine couldn't take close-ups, only general ones. With nowhere near as much detail as in that photo, it wasn't possible to obtain an image that was so precise. When it was published, they used it to attack Father Ernetti, accusing him of fraud. But Ernetti had already informed me that it wasn't from the chronovisor." However, further problems began taking shape. Pellegrino's claim that the image of Christ was captured in 1953 conflicted with other statements that it had been obtained in 1956. The other evidence he provided for the chronovisor's existence, fragments from Quintus Ennius's Lost Thyestes play, fell into the hands of a classical professor at Princeton University. She cast further doubt at their authenticity. As Dr. Teodomrani explained, the text provided by Ernetti was actually very short. It included almost all the fragments of the tragedy that were already known. What Ernetti had defined as new parts, even if they show that the author had a good knowledge of ancient Latin, could not be considered authentic since they contained numerous words that would have entered the Latin language only 250 years after it was already wrote. Now finally, an alleged close confidant eventually stepped forward. The claim was made that Pellegrino admitted to fabricating the play fragments as well as deliberately hoaxing the picture of Christ. This confession was never verified. Those who believe in the chronovisor today point to the possibility that the narrative's 1972 implosion was orchestrated as part of a Vatican cover-up. I mean, this seems entirely possible. After all, if the story is true, church officials expressed profound concerns. Rightfully so. As Pellegrino had noted on numerous occasions, the chronovisor was not only a powerful piece of technology, it was dangerous to both individuals and power structures. Certainly, the Catholic Church, realizing the threat as such, and especially an advancement that could pose its geopolitical influence, would have sought to suppress the truth behind the chronovisor. Leaking an easily identifiable fake photograph would be a quick and easy way to kind of muddy the waters and just completely discredit Pellegrino. Now, in the last few years of his life, Pellegrino even alluded to being silenced, saying this: "The thing is, I'm not free. I've already talked too much. I had the absolute impediment by my superiors to give new explanations, to respond to the accusations, to reaffirm the reality of the chronovisor and the results achieved. Nor can I say that it is my superiors who are preventing me from speaking, because then the pressure of journalists or foreign intelligence services would have been exerted on them. I would have put them in danger. In a sense, the charges brought against me were deemed useful. Since I could not answer, the discredit gradually discouraged all the curious, and that was precisely what they wanted, after the decision to dismantle the device and keep it a secret. I mean, for what it's worth, guys, Pellegrino Ernetti stood by the authenticity of the chronovisor for the rest of his life until he died in 1994. But despite the rumors of a deathbed confession, he continued to speak about its reality, both publicly and in private. Even more compellingly, others maintained his honesty as well, like Don Luigi Borello, despite being one of Pellegrino's most aggressive critics, believed that his claims about the chronovisor's existence were factual. He wrote that the existence of the device is a sacrosanct truth, that many things from the past have been captured with it is also a truth, that among these captured things, there's also the image of Jesus, and Theestes is a truth, and that the supreme authorities have prohibited its use is also a truth. It seems that even Luigi bought into the conspiracy narrative. Pellegrino Ernetti also left a lasting effect on his old friend Francois Brune, who believed the chronovisor claims until his own death in 2019. He once said that his friendship with Father Ernetti lasted 30 years, from 64 to his death in 94. During all this time, we met often and spent dozens of hours together talking about the chronovisor. On some occasions, I went to see Father Ernetti also with some scientist friends, and they too listened to his confidences. I have no evidence to believe that Father Ernetti was a liar or a mythomaniac. I believe what he told me. Of course, Pellegrino had been dead for nearly a decade when Francois released Unsolved Mysteries du Vatican. He had a lot invested in keeping the chronovisor narrative alive. But even in private conversations, he never deviated from his belief in Pellegrino's invention. Speaking with the journalist Javier Sierra, the year of the book's release in 2003, Francois elaborated on his last meeting with his friend and hinted that the chronovisor may yet see the light of day. I saw Ernetti for the last time a few months before his death in 94. He told me that they had just had a meeting in the Vatican with the last living scientist who had collaborated on its construction. There had been 4 cardinals and other scientists, and he told me that they had discussed all that they knew. The unfortunate thing was that the Ernetti would only divulge the name of the scientist once they were already dead. You see, as far as I know, the chronovisor had been dismantled, but Ernetti didn't have much trust in the Vatican. Already, some years before, he had told me that he had deposited his plans with a notary in both Switzerland and Japan. Now, what does this cryptic statement mean? Are we waiting for the day when some dead man's switch triggers and the plans will be released? If so, will they be made public? Can humanity handle such immense power responsibly, or will it lead to our ultimate undoing? As he left his conversation with Francois Brune, Javier Sierra asked the old priest one final question. After all these years, what is your take on the subject? Francois stared directly at the journalist. That the chronovisor existed, he answered, unwavering. Of that, I have no doubt. But more importantly, I want to know what you guys think. Is the chronovisor real? Is the Vatican keeping it a secret? Is there a large, mass-scale conspiracy to keep this kind of technology from getting to the hands of, anybody but the Vatican? Other world governments? The public? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed today's content, be sure to go ahead and slap that like and subscribe button for content similar to this. As always, guys, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll check you guys in the very next episode.